Numbers chapter 20 is notable in that it records the death of Moses' two siblings. At the start of the chapter, his sister Miriam dies, verse 1, and at the end of the chapter, his brother Aaron dies. This chapter also records the event which gives us the reason why both Moses and Aaron were not allowed to enter the promised land. And our emotional response to the story in the first 13 verses of this chapter, and especially as the story concerns Moses, is typically twofold. We feel sad and a lot of sympathy for Moses. After all that, he didn't get in to see it. In itself, that sadness or sympathy is not a wrong response. The other emotional response, though, often somewhat mixed with the first one, is that it doesn't really seem to be fair. Poor Moses, it's not really right that he didn't get in. And when we say that, then we're verging into a wrong response. We're inclined to think that Moses' sin here is not that big a deal. Sure, it's sin. Sure, there are a lot of aggravations, but still. After all, he has done so well and been so faithful up to this point, and he's had to put up with a stubborn, wicked, and rebellious people, and now he's so close to the promised land. In fact, when verse 1 says it's the first month, it means the first month of the 40th year. And yet, he doesn't get in. And no matter how hard the minister is going to explain to you tonight, perhaps you're thinking, I bet at the end of it, I'm still going to think it wasn't really fair of God to do that. Now, there are two main reasons why it is wrong to think that God's judgment in not letting Moses into the promised land was unfair. And the first of the two reasons I'll tell you now. We know that it wasn't unfair because it was an act of God. And He is characterized by infinite and perfect justice. He cannot, by definition, ever act unfairly. That's a vital principle for all of us to understand. Psalm 92, which is entitled, quote, a psalm or song for the Sabbath day, Psalm 92 ends, the Lord is upright, He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in Him. And the idea of that verse being found in that psalm is that this constitutes a good meditation on the Lord's day. The Lord is upright. He's my rock. There is no unrighteousness in Him. The second reason why it was not unfair of God to stop Moses from entering the promised land, well, the second reason you're going to have to wait for. Consider then with me Moses' fall. Moses' fall. First, the situation at Kadesh. Second, the sin of Moses. And third, the judgment of God. Moses' fall, the situation at Kadesh, the sin of Moses, and the judgment of God. Kadesh, mentioned in verse 1, is said to be in the wilderness of Zin, which I take to be, with most others, the same place as Kadesh Barnea, mentioned, for instance, in Numbers 13 and 14. And this Kadesh, or Kadesh Barnea, was a place of sad associations for Israel and Moses. At Kadesh, / Kadesh Barnea, some 38 years before the events of our chapter, Numbers 20, Israel had foolishly believed the despairing report of the 10 unfaithful spies. Numbers 13 and 14. There at Kadesh, God had condemned the nation to wander in the wilderness for a generation until all the adults, that is, all who were 20 or over, were dead. And the years that followed the events of Numbers 13 and 14 had been very weary years, going back and forwards, round and round in that desert land, with carcasses falling in the wilderness. We sang Psalm 90. You could read again Psalm 95, which also deals with this period. The older generations were steadily dying off, but yet when we get to Numbers 20, there were a few more that had to die before Israel could enter in. Numbers 21 verse 6 mentions fiery serpents killing some of them. Numbers 25 has some of them being slain when they committed idolatry and fornication at Baal Peor. But we know by the start of Numbers 20 that there were at least 5 major older people still left in Israel. There were the 2 faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb, whom alone God had promised of that generation, you will get into the land because you have wholly followed me, Caleb, and you too, Joshua. And along with the 2 faithful spies were the 3 children of Amram and Jochebed, Moses, his brother Aaron, who was 3 years older than him, and the eldest of the 3, sister Miriam. Those 5 were left at the very start of the chapter. But then Kadesh, or Kadesh Barnea, was to become a place with more sad associations for Moses, because Miriam, his older sister, his only sister, was to die and be buried there. That's what verse 1 says. Miriam was the one who watched over baby Moses in the basket from the side of the river Nile, and it popped up to Pharaoh's daughter and said, I know just the babysitter you need, the baby's mother. Moses was the one who with her timbrel led the ladies in a song and dance on the other side of the Red Sea. Miriam was also, now this is a little blot on her copybook, she was also the one who led a sort of mini rebellion against Moses in Numbers chapter 12 after Moses married an Ethiopian woman, and she didn't like it, and she said with her brother Aaron, and God spoken by us, not just Moses, who's he to be top dog? And God had to smite her for a while with leprosy. Moses then had Miriam for a sister for the vast majority of his 120 years. 120, or at minimum 119 of his years. She was his sister. For Moses' first 40 years when he was in Egypt, he would have seen her a fair bit. The next 40 years he was in Midian, we don't know what contact they had, but certainly for the last of Moses' 40 years in the wilderness, there she was. 120 years he had lived, and his sister had always been there, and now she's dead. Moses was there at her funeral, and he with Aaron was the chief mourner. He may well have officiated at his sister's burial. So Kadesh was a doubly sad place for Moses, the place of the rebellion, the turning point, when instead of entering Canaan from the south, they spent 38 years going around in circles with carcasses dropping off left and right. And then the place where his sister died. But it was to get worse for Moses at Kadesh, because Kadesh became the place of yet another Israelite grumbling session and rebellion. I say yet another because this is a recurring feature, as you know, of the wilderness wanderings. When they were hemmed in, for example, between the Egyptians and the Red Sea, they grumbled. When the water was bitter at Marah, they complained. When they lusted for meat at Kibroth Hatava, they were at it again.